So good morning, everybody. I hope you guys are having a great conference so far and that everything's gone really well. What I'd like to do is go through, we've been working with the data system and display group for the last year on kind of defining the challenges and what our recommendations would be around those challenges. So I'm just going to go through these and then we'll have a conversation after each one that I discuss. My understanding is that I have an hour. Is that correct, Amanda?
I can't. Can you zoom in on your document to be a little bit larger?
Yes.
Thank you. Beautiful. Everybody's super excited.
Great. So I'm just going to go through these and then we can discuss each one as we go through them. So the first recommendation is about validating indicators and thresholds. And we want to make sure that that's a big piece. Second here. Thank you, Carla, for sending me that picture of myself. I was like, what's going on, Carla? All right, so first recommendation is validating indicators and thresholds. I think that this is a big thing with early warning systems that definitely defines it separate from some of the other tiered systems. So if you look at MTSS or PBIS or RTI, one of the things that's different about early warning systems, obviously, is that we have these valid and predictive indicators. So one of the challenges around that, though, is having that local validation versus having a default recommendation. So a lot of districts don't have the resources to validate or like resources or support to validate these indicators and then identify the different thresholds. So that's something that we're kind of trying to wrestle with on whether we say, yes, I think pretty much where the group has come up so far is that we want to provide districts with a like a base set of like, this is kind of what we think you should start at. And then with a recommendation though of that if you have the ability to check those check those indicators and thresholds to make sure that they actually represent your kids, that would be best. So are there any thoughts on that piece or clarification? And then I'll move back down to the next challenge.
Nobody's volunteering.
Okay. Are there concerns about that coming from the districts or wherever everyone's at?
Oh, yep.
I don't have a concern. I actually really like the idea of a guide for analysts and other users because I think the nationally set cut scores can sometimes be, as it knows, problematic if it doesn't quite align with your district's priorities. So having a guide where you can say, okay, now can you validate this here and here's how you do it, it makes it much easier to get somebody to actually do that for you than if you say, hey, can you validate these indicators? And they'll say, well, what do you mean? So having it spelled out what that would mean would be really helpful.
The other thing that seems valuable about that too is places where, you know, you have schools that are overwhelmed with like the number of tier 3 kids, right? And you can't attack all of them all at once. So having some flexibility to sort of adjust based on your level of need is useful, even if that ideally changes over time as you improve kids out.
Yeah, and in that there's kind of a double, a hidden concern is that, like, so if one state is going to say, okay, we're going to do this early warning systems across the state, so I'll just call out Oregon, like, so we've been working with Oregon, and if they're going to do this across the whole entire state, then are some districts going to like kind of move those thresholds just to make it look like they don't have as many kids flagged or something like that? Like, there's some questions about like how much guidance should be given around setting those thresholds and how much liberty should people have to actually move them.
Yeah, this presumes a certain amount of honesty on the part of the users.
Yes. Well, if you want it to work, I think that's the piece.
Right, yeah.
And that it's not used as a accountability tool.
Exactly.
Right.
That's a really good point. I want to take notes.
Sarah, we're also recording it, so we can send you the recording if that's easier for you.
Yes, that's much easier than I can
Okay.
focus. I'm
You
sorry, I'm like a cold head. I'm like, ugh.
You're fine, no worries. We got it, all the recordings. I'll send them to you.
All right, awesome. All right.
Can you hear?
Yeah, I can hear.
Speak up just a little bit.
This is Amy from Ohio. We were fortunate to have had the relevant West conduct a local validation for 3 Ohio schools for their indicators, and it has validation for an urban, suburban, and a rural. So I'm wondering if some of that could be used as a guidepost almost to say, I mean, obviously you don't want to say this works for you, but if you have a comparable demographic, perhaps could that be used as sort of a frame of reference for folks if they're kind of feeling overwhelmed or?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would, because that assumes that all rural districts and all suburban districts and all urban districts are kind of the same. But it's like, because a lot of it is about school climate and culture as well. That's a big piece of this. And so I think if we had like just one kind of set of like, okay, here, start here. If you don't have the resources to locally validate, start here. But then if you know, as this kind of works its way through the pipes and we get more support around it, then maybe at some point I've had a couple of districts that after a year of working with me and starting with just those basic indicators, then about a year later, they actually went to the school board and asked for funding to fund somebody else. But that actually gets into another recommendation that we have in a little bit. So, okay. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and go down just a little bit more. Again, this is around the local validation. So competing early warning system models, there's been, one of the potential solutions would be the self-service model, where instead of feeding a finished product into an organization, you could actually create this infrastructure that could be used locally to create their own reports. So that's something that Montana does right now, is that basically people put in they upload their data into the system. It's never held by the state itself, but it does do the validation for them in a way, and then gives them back their reports. So that was one thing that we were thinking. Also in our recommendations, what we would want to make sure and look at is that we're not under identifying students. So if districts are setting their own thresholds, we want to be able to provide enough information to them that they know that there are benefits and costs to both monetary and resource wise if we over identify kids, or also if we under identify kids and we lose a lot of kids that, or don't identify a bunch of kids that actually need the support. There's also this trade-off between flexibility and interpretability. So the local accommodations that need to be considered should start, could start to validate by the district and then create parameters for different local conditions. And this is just another piece that we've been trying to think about, like what would we actually suggest for districts to start out with. Another possibility would be able to create a software solution possibly for like the back-end model. So again, providing these predictive model formulas so that people can do their own validation. I think that kind of sums up a lot of that I just talked about, was just being able to provide districts with the tools that they need to actually validate this on their own. Any other?
Sarah, I'm sorry. I do know that I have seen a document also that was about district creating early warning indicators. It was, I don't know if it was AIR or REL West or something. Is that a comparable kind of a resource guide?
What was the beginning of that?
It's called the District Guide for Creating Early Warning Indicators.
For validating early warning indicators? Is it by REL Midwest?
I don't know.
I think Rural Midwest, I think Jenny Scala was
This one?
working on.
Yeah, that's it. That's Jerry
Okay.
explained it, yeah.
Yeah, I really like that guide. I think that I'm not ready to say that like that's definitely the end all be all, or because I think there's a couple of different ways of validating indicators. So we've brought together like 4 different ways of validating these indicators. It's not like a perfect science, I don't think. There's some art to it, and so I particularly like that guide from Real Midwest, but I would definitely want to put that through the larger data group before just saying that. But it would be something like comparable to that. I mean, that's like, that would be like the hard copy kind of version of that. But then this software solution would be like, all right, we have something that you can just put onto your student information system. EdFi is a really big
Yeah.
player in this. And so if there was some way to actually allow the districts to just do something in EdFi and then have it spit out the correct validation.
Okay, thank you.
Any other thoughts? Okay. So the next conversation is about composite versus individual indicators. And there's a couple of different ways that you can think about this. The benefit to having a composite indicator, so what the group has kind of talked about is having both. So maybe having something where that's composite, that we can actually identify and prioritize which students we're actually going to be talking about, but then having the individual indicators so that we can actually get down into root causes of why the student is struggling. So if it's like, so in Montana, for example, they use a predicted dropout probability score that's calculated for them. And so each kid gets like basically a number, and the higher the number, the more of a probability they are of dropping out. So the districts can actually look at it and say, okay, we're going to focus on kids that are just starting to like look like they're having some major issues. So I think some of the schools have used like the cutoff of like 12 and 15 or something like that. And then that just allows them to be able to say, okay, this is a smaller, more manageable group of kids that we can discuss. And then we can actually look at, okay, what is causing this composite indicator to be higher? Is it the attendance? Is it the behavior? Is it the course performance? Or any other indicators that we have going on? So that's kind of like the idea behind having this composite and the individual indicator. The composite would be some kind of combination of the different indicators that kind of summarizes it to just give teams a little bit something more to like identify the kids. I'm going to stop there for a minute and then let you guys talk, because I think the other thing, our conversations with Johns Hopkins and Joanna and Bob have been around looking at a composite indicator that actually that would be for academic tenacity, basically, or academic rigor. But we'll talk about that in a minute. What are your else thoughts on the composite versus the individual indicators?
So it was something that Bob had said, the discussion we had about what do we include on, I'll call it the checklist, I'm not necessarily like that term. So this becomes important that we understand what's the core indicators, because then they would be the part of the composite, and the non-core would be part of the composite. Unless there's a way through data that you're allowed to, that you can actually, you can understand what's not in the composite, and it's still get a good score, even though you put all three together.
I mean, one of the challenges of a composite is it doesn't tell you up front what's going on behind the scenes. And the single indicators tell you that up front, basically. And then the second issue you're raising is, if you were to do a composite, what you put into it. And I certainly have seen districts where everything and the kitchen sink is put into it. And then people don't know what to do with it. An additional consideration, though, is that data systems have gotten very, very much more adept in the last 10 years, and much more is possible easily than was there 10 years ago. So I'm going to stop talking and hope that some of you will jump in with your thoughts. Mara.
I like this idea.
You just gotta speak up.
Oh, sure.
Yep.
I like the idea of trying to prioritize. I think that's really important. So the composite does get at that. One concern I have is that we then detract or we encourage detraction from root cause analysis, because when people see urgency, then they want to jump in immediately, and so we go right into intervention or action, and we get the analysis. So because it requires an extra step, they still have to unpack the composite to figure out the problem, and so we're making it harder for them in some ways to do that, and kind of is essential.
Yeah, and I do want to say that the way that we've been talking about using that for teams to actually use that composite indicator would be looking at the kids who have most recently had a large jump, perhaps in that number, in that composite indicator number, or kids who are not so far off track, because those are the kids that are hardest to get back on track, right? So if they're really at a high probability of dropping out, those are actually the kids that we have been saying, maybe there's other systems that within the school that are helping reconnect them and things like that, but where an early warning system really has a lot of its power is actually where we can use it to catch those kids as they first start to fall off track, right? So using that composite indicator to just kind of like, okay, we're going to focus on these kids. And then, I mean, that's a conversation though, obviously for the school teams to have, would be which kids do we want to focus on? I think the kids who are really far off track, people generally know that those kids are really far off track. And so the early warning system doesn't have as much value added for identifying those particular kids.
Hey, Sarah, this is William from MDRC. I mean, I think that the thing that matters most is if the composite improves the predictability of sort of the kids that are at risk, then it's, then it's high value. And then if you combine it with the specs framework that's emphasizing the analysis side to reinforce, right, that you have to pay attention to then that next step of seeing what's underneath it, then it's great. Like if the composite works better than the individual indicators to help me identify the kids most at risk or on some continuum of risk, then great, like terrific, as long as it's feasible for the schools or districts to execute whatever needs to be executed to generate that score. I think that's great.
Okay. Yeah, and I think the districts that I've talked to that are in Montana that are using both the composite and the individual is, oh man, I just totally lost my train of thought. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to come back to, because if they were just looking at the kids who had the attendance, and then they looked at all the kids who had the behavior flag, and then looked at all the kids that had the course performance flag, and then looked at all the kids who had both attendance and behavior, and the kids who had attendance and course performance. It's like, which group of kids do we focus on if we're having a small group meeting with a team to actually try to identify what interventions there might be? The other thing about this is that, and so here's where I'm gonna like scroll down a little bit on the screen, is that there is a confusion sometimes in districts that we've noticed getting confused with like the multi-tiered systems of support. Just we think that they should be within this and this framework so that we can, I'm gonna have to go a little bit smaller here, guys. So that you still have like this kind of looking at the school-wide systems and how many kids we're flagging. Sorry. Looking at the school-wide system and like looking at the data holistically across the whole entire school and seeing where everybody's struggling. And so that can help you actually build up these universal supports like in your tiered system. But then also being able to, like, this just kind of gives people a little bit more to look at, because I think there is some confusion of like, just because a kid is a yellow kid, that doesn't necessarily mean that they need a small group strategy. And so I think that that's another piece that we need to like clarify a little bit for everyone, is that your thresholds for your indicators, whether you're going composite or individual or both, your thresholds for your indicators are not necessarily the same thing as these tiered systems, where we're looking at school-wide small group versus targeted. Does that make sense? Yeah, go.
Jenny, loud and speak
Yeah,
loudly.
sorry. Okay, so I think one of the concerns I always have with like composite versus individual indicators is that the composite indicators will actually situate whatever's going on within the student. And so it's easy to kind of sometimes lose track of the bigger patterns. Like if you have an issue with gender gaps in your school, that may or may not emerge through the composite measure. I mean, I guess we could aggregate it that way, but you sort of know, oh, you just kind of know what you kind of already know. But there could be things where there are patterns where it's really just your first period classes that students are failing a lot of, or something like that. And that won't necessarily come out in a composite measure. So I think, I mean, I don't think this is like, it's not like you can't do that when you have a composite measure, but it does sort of start to really make you think about what are the risk factors that this kid has and what's happening with an individual student, as opposed to taking a step back sometimes and trying to understand what are things that are about an individual student's situation versus things that are happening on a more global level within the school.
Right, which is why you want to look at the building levels first.
Right.
And look at individual children.
And so Jenny, do you think that that would still be true if you had both of them, if you had the composite indicator for like the group? Like, and so again, this is talking about like an individual student team. So if you had the composite that was just like, these are the 10 kids that we're going to talk about the next hour and a half. And then also having the individual indicator so that you could actually kind of get into that root cause analysis. Do you think that would be okay?
So I don't think you can't do it, but I could sort of see where you grab like the 10 kids who are within a particular range, but it's actually like 30 kids who are in that, and you may not notice it because within that 10 kids, there may not be that same pattern happening. And so it's not like you can't do it, but I think it's something that you start to think about the risk of dropping out as being about a kid phenomenon, as opposed to actually taking a bigger picture and sort of saying, what is it that our school may be doing that is contributing to this, and then going into what is needed for individual students or groups of students.
And Sarah, just to clarify, we've been having kind of a running conversation back and forth about the extent to which we're looking at individual interventions, responses, actions, and the extent to which we're also looking at patterns in the school and across the building. And really, I think that conversation has come down to both situations where the intervention may happen initially at the individual level, but the school-wide intervention or grade-wide intervention may be needed. But
Yeah.
that's the theme.
So one thought I have, Bob, is that I can almost see the utility of the composite in combination with the individual coming more into play on the post-secondary readiness side as opposed to the high school graduation side. The high school graduation side, the challenge is if they're being low at any of those things, it's a problem in itself. Even if it ranks lower in some index, if you're missing a month of school, you're constantly in trouble. If you're failing classes, like none of that leads to a good result. Even if you might have a slightly greater chance of, I know the bootstraps recover somehow from some position than another, right? So I'm not sure what's gained. I think you still have to figure out how we're going to help all those kids in the most efficient way with the resources we have. But I think on the college readiness, we may not be there yet with enough data. That's the problem to it. So maybe the thing to work is that's where we're running on this thing of like, okay, so our things are like 97% attendance and a B average, and once we're identified some good like social emotional skills. And there I think we are a little bit saying like, what combination do you just monitor, and what combination do you have to do something? And potentially there's many more kids in that area than in the other area, right? So even this thing of like, even with massive resources, right, potentially, and actually not needing to respond to, like, what's greater way to having a more powerful predictive analytic composite that would give us guidance to say, it's this combination that's more problematic than that. Now, my only caveat with that is I think there's an allure there. I bet some of that, when you do the analysis, is partially driven by some policies that are in place that make one thing more important than another in a place and time. And if that policy changes after you've done your algorithm, like the algorithm might not be accurate. Like that's like there's gonna be a need to keep updating the algorithm, which is another burden put on somebody. So I mean, there's complexities there, but it seems like maybe it's in that area that benefit of knowing who gives greater benefits versus the cost, and like on the high school graduation.
There's gotta be the understanding that you have to update that algorithm, change policies and driving.
Can automate that.
Can you hear that?
Yeah.
Can you guys speak up as you guys are responding to Bob? Sorry, just so Sarah can see.
I mean, you can automate the algorithm development in machine learning. So we're starting to experiment with that, not in some of our education work, but some of our other work. We can build in the system so that as stuff changes, it'll continue to update itself to keep the predictive power sort of up to date with other things that are happening over time. Right.
And just, I appreciate both of those. Oh, if you guys want to keep talking, that's fine. I have a question afterwards.
I just want some clarification. Curious of the thought you just shared, is the composite the replacement for the college?
No,
student?
it'll be a piece of guidance to help figure out. We were saying yesterday, like, we look at those indicators. You have a bunch of kids at 92% attendance. You have some kids that are like 2.9. And you have some kids that are like, when do you monitor, when do you react? It's like, right now, it's sort of a field question, right? We don't know enough. And so if we had enough data, you got some guidance that say, these combinations are more problematic than this. These kids actually need to do something with now. These kids, like, we get some help with that. Potentially, there's like more kids in that population, like in the I'm trying to graduate high school, so that's where maybe that utility of like giving us a better, probably narrow our focus a little bit, might have more utility and offset some of the costs. I mean, there's still costs, but it's like it's worth it because on the other side there's costs not happening.
I mean, I think Sarah, if the data team recommendation is sort of a both and thing, I think that works. And people should, I think districts and states or whomever should have an opportunity to at least see what the, how a composite works against individual indicators, and through practice may learn that the practicalities are better or worse, than whether it's the system level sort of bigger picture, the individual student level. And Bob's point, at high school versus post-secondary.
Yeah.
This may also get into the question, and it may later on with Sarah's discussion. In some of the big rural states, the state is the one that develops the early warning system, basically. The small districts don't have that capacity in many cases. And the state does not have access to some of the data that in a big urban district or a smaller district would be immediately accessible. I mean, you begin to get into strong philosophies of local control and what is the state allowed to see. And the answer in some states is very little. Okay? That would be the local's inclination. And the state's not going to provide it. So it becomes who's developing the system and where does the information reside once it's been collected. And that becomes an issue. It's clearly solvable. I think there are some states where the information does go up, it's processed, it comes back, and the state never really sees it. The machines see it. But there are those fears.
Yeah, and that's kind of around the advice solution in some of the states that are looking at that. Because that does allow the districts to have the local control over the data. It doesn't actually get stored at the state at all. One other question I have for you guys, just as everybody's in the room, is have you guys talked about how you do suggest that a team identifies the kids? Like, okay, so yes, there needs to be like a systems look at the data and being able to analyze that to see where there's these trends and that we can help address at like that universal level. But also, we are still talking about individual students sometimes, right? So there's still a team that's going to be talking about the individual students. My question is, how do you identify the kids that are that group is going to talk about when there's a small capacity? It's like one team that meets once a week, or do you suggest that teams meet more often than that?
Comments from somebody?
Well,
Dave,
that,
California.
that's a question we recognized and we're aware of, but we haven't solved. So I think that's an open question for us at this
But you have what?
It's an open question for us at this point. Yeah.
Okay.
I would just say to the frequency of meetings, if a team's going to be doing case management as part of their work, it's a little bit of a different context, but like with the kind of teams that we have experience with, I think minimum of bi-weekly is the right frequency. Because otherwise, just if you're not meeting more frequently than that, then your ability to sort of case manage on a short cycle is just not, there's just a lack of alignment between frequency and charge of the team. I guess if I can, I want to circle back to make a bit of a comment on the composite versus individual question. So, it seems to me that like, at a first analysis, the most kind of rough cut way to do compositing is if you have these different, categories, say behavior, attendance, course performance. The most kind of rough composite would be, who are students who have, like one of those indicators in a trouble zone versus two of those indicators in a trouble zone. So it just occurs to me that like whatever composite you might want to use, since it would have to be sort of validated on its own terms, right? Like it seems to me inadequate to say, we're going to composite all these students into having like one indicator, because the risk associated with having just the behavior indicator as opposed to just the course performance indicator might be totally different, as far as like what the predictability is of that student's like later meaningful outcomes. So since a composite would essentially have to be sort of validated on its own terms, or like how predictive are the categories of something we care about, there might be a role for a composite in prioritizing which students come up for case management, even if the content of that discussion doesn't dwell on that composite basically at all. Because in order to do any kind of case management or assignment of interventions, you must sort of dig into like what is the particularities of that student situation. So I'm wondering if there's some kind of a way to integrate both, where a composite might be derived to sort of prioritize which students come up for case management, but doesn't play much of a role in like digging into the case management. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, that's the idea behind it.
Okay.
And
I mean, go on.
I was just going to say, we had an interesting conversation just before we joined you about, we did not get into the size of teams nor the frequency of meetings. It was more the organization of teams within a school and their relationship to the district, and just how many teams might be needed, what was the most efficient and effective structure to deal with it. So it was not, I think the consensus of the group was largely that we needed a mega team, a mega team, decision-making team that would then devolve some of the responsibilities. Is that a correct group? Do you think that's a correct way to put what we decided?
We reached consensus
That's
on
what Bob
that,
said.
on whether there should be a mega team or not. But we did talk a lot about, recognizing local context and the function.
Right.
And we did recognize that if there are too many teams, the burden of coordination is too great. And so certainly we cautious about the number.
Okay, thanks. Lauren?
Just one quick clarification before we move on to talk about tracking intervention. Sarah,
That window's
can
on
you talk
your
a little
end,
bit about
sorry.
the behavior indicator? Can you talk a little bit about the behavior indicator? Because I know it's so varied and it's really particular to local context. So how would that play into the composite?
Yeah, so the type of composite indicator that we were talking about in the data systems group has been actually running a predictive model on the probability of dropping out. So what you would get out of that, or the inputs to that model would be things like attendance, behavior, however you're defining that, like if it's ODRs or ISS or OSS or something like that. But putting all of those variables in there and seeing which ones are most predictive, and then being able to actually run this model that would give you a predicted probability score.
Yeah, I understand. I'm wondering, now, within a district, if schools are calculating behavior differently, one school says office referral, one school says out of school suspension, how that would impact the composite.
Well, because every school is putting in what they're using, then that, because that would, again, with this, it would be like, if there's this model that we can like upload the data into, so every school is uploading their own data, and every school is getting their own predictive analytics out of it. Does that make sense? So if they're using, like, let's say Portland is using this measure of behavior and Centennial School District is using a different measure of behavior, each one of them are having their indicators, this composite indicator, validated separately based on their own data. So from that, you could see what's most predictive based on their particular data. Does that make sense?
Oh, okay, yeah, so the district would just need to have the capacity to do that for each school.
Or if at some point we were able to actually put together some kind of predictive modeling package for like some software solution, you know, that people could actually use through EdFi or something like that, that would already be programmed in though.
Thank you.
There is also the fact that we are adding to an EWS, college and career readiness, and that is what we are, or yeah, college and readiness for post-secondary something or other. We can talk about that too. So we need to make sure that we are also thinking about those factors.
Yes, and actually that gets into the other type of composite indicator that we've had conversations about, which is maybe a composite indicator of all the different kinds of academic preparedness things that kids need to be able to go on to college and be accepted. All right, any other last thoughts before we move on? Because I'm getting mindful of time. We have 20 minutes left.
Move on.
All right, we're going. So the next piece, can you see?
Yeah,
this?
that little box is on your end. You should be able to move that box off to the side.
It doesn't, I don't know what it's doing. It's like kind of going in and out, flashing on me, so I don't.
I unfortunately can't do anything. I believe it's on your end from the sharing.
Yeah, that's weird. Maybe if I. Okay. All right, I have no idea. I think.
What I'll do, Sarah, is I'm just going to see about giving you full control.
Okay.
I'll make you the host, and maybe that'll help with it.
Okay.
Let's see if that, I don't know.
So I'm just going to talk about this as we try to figure out this technical difficulty. I've never seen this window before.
Neither have I. This is new.
All right. So the other thing that we want to make sure is that that these systems are in real time. So that's kind of a side note, is that we do need to make sure that these systems are in real time, and that they're not just based off of last year's data or something, or last year's data or something like that. But one of the things that we want to make sure that we are doing is creating a system that also has the ability to track the interventions for students. So again, thinking about that, I think somebody was using the word case management. As we're thinking about these kids, like what other interventions have they been given? So both like on the student level, identifying like, okay, now we're looking at their attendance. Let's actually do some root cause analysis. Which hours are they actually missing? Is it the first period or something? You know, so as our team is kind of going through this process of identifying why the student is struggling in those indicators, then they need to be able to say, okay, here are the supports that we have for that student based on that particular issue that they're having. And then we also want to look at it at that student level, but we also want to look at it at the overall school level, so that we can actually begin to start to do a soft evaluation of which interventions are actually moving the students. So it's really important that if we have, like, let's say check in, check out or something like that, that we can see over the course of a semester, over the course of a year, how many kids do we actually put in this program? How often did they participate? And then what happened afterwards. Did they actually improve or not? And then as a whole, is that pretty much what we're seeing with this intervention, so that we can actually start to look at what might be more effective than others, and start to design our resources around that. So that's like kind of a longer scale picture of being able to actually not evaluate rigorously, but just kind of look at trends, at least, of how students are performing in the different interventions. So both on the student level and then also at the systems level, that's kind of one of our suggestions. Are there any thoughts on that one?
Go ahead.
Okay. Sorry.
Bob, one question is like, are there good models of this yet from the software vendors and stuff you've been talking with others?
There's not one that we've seen that's good for both. So we've seen individual system, and we're still trying to. Gates had said, some folks from Gates on our last conversation had said that they might have some examples. I think at the post-secondary level, I think it's the Dell Scholars Program or something like that that has an intervention tracking along with the indicators. But yeah, there's not very many examples out there that do both. Other thoughts? Other questions? Okay. So the next recommendation is really, it kind of gets into what you guys were talking about with those different views of the data, looking at it system-wide versus looking at it at that student level. And so one of our recommendations is also to develop these kinds of data displays for the different user groups. So if you're a superintendent, for example, you're going to maybe want to look at that holistic trend data of how students across the building are doing in attendance, behavior, course performance, all the indicators. Whereas like a student team that's going to be identifying the students, they actually need kind of a different view. And so that was another one of our recommendations. Any other thoughts on that?
Will there be any, this is Katie from Kentucky, all of our schools use the same assessment now. Will there be any assessment of what districts already use and how it might integrate? How they might have to change what they're doing?
Did you hear that? So how if a system already has or if a school district or state like Kentucky already has a system in place, is there any sort of discussion about how this would integrate in with that, or evaluate, is that right, what is already in place, or is there a way for it to, what systems will already, yes, what will or will not, I guess, integrate with what the recommendations?
States are very interested in this model. Is it going to be a heavy lift or not?
If states are interested, will it be a heavy lift or not?
And what about cost?
And what about cost? And
yeah, I think I don't have, I think if a state wants to do this, like I think that what we would like to do is provide the recommendations, and I think our group as a whole is going to have to decide what to do with those recommendations after we come up with them. Like, is there a national need right now to have something that's actually validating the indicators in the back piece, like through an Ed5 program or something like that, but then also provides this platform that tracks the indicators as well as the interventions that kids are getting? Like, I don't know what all of that looks like. I think we're still trying to, like, what ideally would that piece together and look like? And then after we have that view based on everybody's points of view, which by May we will definitely have it, and we're fleshing it out like next week when everybody's coming here for the data display group. But I think we need all of those pieces to know what are our solid recommendations around this. And then I think one of the next pieces is actually, do we actually build the tools to do this? Because I think that's a real possibility. But I don't know. I can't talk to the cost necessarily at this point.
This is Vincent. I'm just going to punch. I think this is actually one of the most important of the recommendations in some respects, because I think of our team there's always at least three tensions. One tension is just data you have to see in order to monitor the system. The other tension is data you need to see to implement a business process, a standard work process. And I think the third tension is kind of what we've been talking about here, the data you need to see in order to start a root cause analysis. And so I think the displays here can actually be a really important entry into all three of those conversations. So I'm just affirming that I think this recommendation has a lot of potential to help organizations orient folks in a way that can be very meaningful and allow them to take action appropriately. So the monitoring question versus the intervention question versus the root cause analysis question, I think there's a lot of potential here through the display of data.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think part of that is actually what's on the screen right now of how do we actually rein in the scope creep of this by adding too much information that just completely overloads. Like, and again, that might get into how do we prioritize which students we're talking about, right? And then what data do you actually need? These systems need to be dynamic like that so that you can actually drill down when needed, and then actually come back up and see overall trends or of the particular student and of the school. But yeah, having that ability to go in and out, zoom in and out is really important. One of the other things that we had talked about was just making sure that the number of indicators should be limited, just so there's not completely, we don't want 16 different indicators because then it's like, okay, which indicator are we actually focusing on? Again, as a school team or as a student, as a team focused on the students, that can get really hard and to identify which kids we're actually going to be talking about. Another thing that we wanted to make sure that these kind of district-wide reports did. So again, this is all under the recommendation of having different reports and different access to data based on who you are and what focus you're looking at right now. But another one is to, at the district level at least, or school level, is to make sure that you're aligning those outcomes with other outcomes that you're prioritizing in the school, so that you're using existing methods to collect the data, that you're aligning that then with the priorities of like, okay, if we're having an attendance focus in our school, like that's a huge thing out here in Oregon and other places too. If we're actually saying in our school priorities that this is what we're going to be focusing on, making sure that those are aligned with the early warning system and just that communication, because that actually kind of gets into this recommendation 5 about how we actually disseminate these reports. And we want to make sure that there's some considerations in professional development around looking at disaggregated data so that we don't just start pointing fingers at the kids and being like, okay, well, that's that group of kids. Obviously, they're having problems. Like, that's not the way that we want people to be talking about. That's not a solution to helping kids. So any thoughts on that real quick? I know we only have like about 10 minutes, so. Another piece is this looking at making sure that we have champions within the district, making sure that we're not selling the reports versus actually creating like a collaborative process to build the reports. Because I think that's another thing that we've talked a lot about in our group is once you start to have somebody that's gathering this data and now you have a team that's looking at data, like people can get sidetracked really easily. So, or you know, they're like, well, we're actually already doing this over here in our group and we're doing this already over here. And so there's like this kind of interagency fighting over grounds. And so we want to make sure that we're being inclusive of all the different people who might be needing data, at least so that we don't create competing initiatives within the school or district. Ground the data in individual stories to make the work compelling is another recommendation. And design these systems that take big unchangeable factors into account, for example, like teacher turnover. We also would need to be able, I think somebody else was talking about policy things. So we need to be able to think about the things that might be changing over time that might make the indicators different. And then the 6th recommendation is looking at creating a well-balanced team and securing that funding to actually support the initiative. So like I was talking about earlier, we've had some districts that, you know, that first year, maybe they're just using national recommendations on the thresholds and indicators, but then they actually go to the school board and they get approval to actually have a data scientist or somebody come in and actually build a system specifically for them. And so we just want to make sure that that's in people's minds. I think somebody brought up cost with the state level, but I think also at the district and school level, I have this question all the time of like, well, should I go with a vendor and how much would that cost? Or should I have somebody like a whole FTE here at my school or my district? And how much, how much is this going to cost me at the end of the day? So I think we need to be considering some of that and making sure that we are providing solutions that maybe can be automated so that there's not as big of a cost on the districts. I don't know. We'll see where that one goes. But on these teams, we want to definitely make sure that we have a mix of technical people who build the system, but then also those policy level people that are going to be able to help align that work really well. A lot of the folks in my group have worked really closely with districts over time in building these systems, and one of the things that they found is that one administrator will be like, okay, yes, this is what we want to do, and then they get kind of pulled in another direction by a different administrator. And so again, that interagency conflict, we want to try to minimize that as much as possible. So creating this team where everybody's kind of around the table at the very beginning to make sure that their voice is heard, and that also creates the buy-in for the system if you feel like your voice is being heard.
If I could add, this is Amy. I just want to echo, I believe that's a really important part. And we found that if you are including the folks that are going to be involved and in the system and in the data right from the beginning, so they recognize the importance of the work, they feel like they're a real part of the team. I mean, if they are a part of the team, they're going to get more, they're going to have more buy-in too. So I think they start to recognize how important they are in the process. And I know some of our data folks have been to keep people to recognize trends that lots of school, folks haven't. They have a better mind for the data, and as they start to put it in or pull it out or whatever the case may be, they can really be so instrumental. So I agree, and just really stressing how important it is to keep them involved.
One thought about the thing that's at the very top of the screen around who should be on the team. I love the idea of a manager, coach, or champion, someone who's in charge of that. One thing we've also found is that sometimes there's not someone who understands how to up and download the data, and so that might be a separate role.
Mm-hmm.
And again, keeping that person in the loop so they understand why they're doing it.
Yeah, they're part of it.
Yep. And they really have much more buy-in.
Yeah. Well, and having an understanding of where are there different data collections being done already. I know I've walked in some, even a relatively small school, and they're like, oh, our teachers are already putting in data for their PBIS, and then they're also putting in data for this, and then they're also putting in data, and so they're like triple entering data now, and like these individual teachers, and we don't want to overburden people like that. So if you have somebody that actually knows of all of these different systems that are already being funded, we're going to try to take advantage of those, and having that kind of central person with that knowledge is important. Other thoughts on this one? Again, this kind of works into making the work a priority, getting leadership to move things forward. And again, this is like who should be on this team? How do we create meaningful reports and make everybody sure that, that they understand how this overlaps with the work that they are doing? The more that we can provide those kind of holistic maps in people's heads of like, this is how this all works together, that's really important because it also honors the work that people have done in the past. And we want to, I don't know, I think that's been a big contention when I go into districts is like, well, this has been my initiative over here, and what are you doing trying to come in and take it over or something like that? And it's like really a lot of these things can play nicely together and actually strengthen each other when we use them. So again, if the early warning system actually has that predictive analytics built into it, then that's going to be a stronger screener than, let's say, just having a number from RTI or PBIS or something like that. Recommendation about finding a sponsor for the project. That might be for superintendent or also even states. And then we also want to discuss just the timeline of how long this actually, because that's another question that comes up, is that how long is an appropriate timeline? How long is this going to take us to get off the ground? And so we're kind of playing around with this one still, where it's like, you know, maybe it's a 6-month to build consensus. I think that building consensus piece at the very beginning, as we're building the data systems and reports, is really important. But yeah, so making sure that we can build consensus, maybe that takes 6 months, and then being able to pilot it for 3 months and then actually rolling it out. But that seems really ambitious to me based on what I've seen in the past, but if that could be ideal. I don't know. What do you guys think about how long this might take, both at a district level and then also at a state level? And that's the last that I have, so. All right, everybody's okay with that?
Is that to begin the building or to like?
Yeah, so the initial would be like when we're building up the consensus around what's going to be, you know, making sure that all of those people are in the room, that we're having these conversations. That can take a really long time to figure out. So that's what some of our folks have been saying is like 6 months to build out that consensus across this would be across the state.
So we have an idea to do this because of the whole system challenge that we think we should go to the Gates Foundation. They should build this system and give it to the districts free, and then the districts just have to hire a data person. And so integrate all these workflows, all these other sorts of things into that. So you actually have the big picture, you can drill down and slice and dice in lots of different ways. And why not like that with you? Impact. So, Bob, that's on.
Did you hear, Sarah, did you hear all that?
I'm happy to write letters of support.
They're saying that the recommendation is that Gates would fund it and do everything, and that they would give it out free to everybody, and it'd be able to do all the things and everything, and that they could utilize it as they see fit and input and do everything, but that Gates should handle the whole thing.
I agree with that. If they need help, you know, we can help them with that.
Right.
I mean, I think that this is Carla. Hey, Sarah. And I think that this is all, I mean, trying to get my thoughts on this. In a district that has struggled for years with trying to stand up a dashboard that pulls data from our student information system and has the reports, and we actually have pretty decent reports relative to some areas, but then for it to be adaptive enough where you have that IT power to then say, oh no, that's not our threshold, this is our threshold, like, and then for it to interface with our data warehouse so that we can be adaptive in our dashboard reports. And we're a decent sized district. Smaller districts are like, they have 2 people doing anything that has the word technology in it. Or data in it. And then the whole issue of, okay, once you see the reports, the whole issue of how are you tracking your actions relative to the data, and how do you know if your actions have an impact? And Sarah, we've talked about this ad nauseum. So, and then, we are still confounded with that issue as a district. And so I want to echo, in all seriousness, that if there were some technological guidelines or frameworks for how this could exist, and then there were some big funders who said, we're going to come together a little bit like when Mott, Gates, and the funders group, right? And they all came together around a pretty big initiative. And so having a funders group around this work, say we understand the technology challenges in actually being able to know if what you're doing has an impact on kids. And I think that it is, you know, we have in our state we have Synergy, which is run by EduPoint, that how they interface with EdFi, and I'm sure there's a gazillion other student information systems out there. And then has that interface with the college. It is a huge, complex system, and it takes a gigantic amount of money
Yes.
to actually get it up and running. So the recommendations are great, but I still am like, I don't want to make it so big that it's undoable, but I feel like in every place where I talk about this work, it always comes back to, but how are we tracking our interventions so we know it's effective? And
Yeah.
And then the room is silent.
Yep.
Or we say we have spreadsheets.
Right.
I would
Yeah.
say there are other pieces that seem to me, having worked with a lot of states and districts and schools, are almost as equally important as the technology. I mean, the technology is one set of things. I personally think, for the most part, when you don't have lots of programmers on staff, that going with vendors who after 10 years are figuring out, this is just my personal thought. But then, once you've got the technology, you've got to get the data collected and inputted.
Right.
That's a whole separate issue that needs training, and it needs constant training, and it needs protocols. People turn over. Okay, then the data's in the system. You've got to get reports out. Reporting, whether it's interventions or whatever it is, just getting a report out is the next challenge. Then getting people who can read that report and understand that report. That's maybe the biggest piece to me when you talk about rollout and piloting. It's convincing everybody, those English teachers and social studies teachers who don't like looking at data, that they can understand patterns in data. And then you get to the team process, or maybe somewhere in there you've got team process, and you've got the decision about interventions, putting interventions, actions into place, and then tracking them. So it is about a 10-step process, each of which takes training, monitoring of the training, and the turnover of personnel, retraining. So it's a really complicated challenge in front of us with many components.
Yeah. That's why it would be so nice if we were, because there's all this like professional development around data literacy and all of the things that you just mentioned, Joanna. That's why it would, if we were able to give districts like, okay, here is the tool that you use. Even if it's going through like a vendor, that they can communicate with the vendor even. I think that that's a big piece, is at least empowering people to be able to say, this is what we need to have an effective system. Maybe we spread it out over several years of like, okay, here's this piece of the system, and then this next year we take this piece of the system or something like that. But at least having some kind of blueprint that we can give people of like, all right, these are definitely the things that you would need in your system. I think that whether they're working internally or with a vendor, that those are important things that we need to empower people to be able to communicate about.
So I'm willing to be the odd one out. I worry about one answer in a national, the Common Core still reverberates in my head. I just think thinking about some innovation, some reiteration at different places and different communities, because at the end of the day, I think it's not a technology issue as much as Joanna's saying, it's a people issue. And something coming in from a national, here's the answer. Been there, done that.
Eli.
So I work at the
Can you speak? Eli, you're gonna have to speak up since you're in the back.
Come on up, louder.
So I would be interested in having like a serious conversation about what you think the needs are, what you think the possibilities are, and how what could address them. I think in general we have like a very poor track record of trying to find the one solution to the technology problem that gets sustained and then gets like has a mechanism for getting updated as needed. And so, but like I think we are definitely interested in trying to be part of helping to solve some of these issues. And I think like having a conversation about what we think is possible and what we think be useful would be really valuable. Like, that reaction is
not like wanting to back away from, that, us funding that one solution, but there are a bunch of other funders interested in supporting data use, and I think whether or not that ends up with funding, what you have in mind, like I think there could be a lot of value in that discussion.
Thank you very much.
In Georgia, we withstood, we needed more than probably a lot of states the Common Core effort, and we withstood the backlash that came from that. And so I hear that, and we really would need to make it a non-federal type of agency versus national. But we have some really good working relationships with SREB, and bringing a regional approach to something like this, and then having the regions work together so that there was a common framework, to me seems to be one way to do it. And then I think that your point is building in on the front end, and here's the technology, but Gates and other funders are not going to support this for an extended period of time, that it has to be sustainable within the context of either the state work or big district work, that type of thing. Because I think, lessons learned is that the federal government sends out money, the program works really well, but with government, that's all fun, and unfunded mandates are never, ever going to take root in a way that's going to be impactful for the nation. So I think we've really got to work on creating that balance, and then a regional, I can see in Georgia, SREB being the umbrella, and then we have our regional education service agency within Georgia that we've driven out our PBIS work really well. So it's helped the small districts, and the big districts have gotten technical support. So I think there are ways to do it. We just need to be very intentional, and how, to your point, is how we build it out, right, so that it doesn't feel like it's coming from Congress or US DOE as a mandate.
I think everything I've heard around the country, it's not just the South, is don't tread on me, basically. Yeah. Stay away.
Yeah. And I say that from the South because I think that we've still got some of the largest gaps to overcome, so that if we can be a guinea pig in this work, we end up being helped in ways far deeper than some of the other parts of the country.
Well, I know that was kind of, that local control piece is really, really important. And like, that's huge out here in the West as well. Like, it's the Wild West of Montana and all these other district or states that we work with out here. And I mean, that we do want to make sure that we're valuing the local control of what people are already doing. And so it's more of like, what is the blueprint of things that should be involved in these to make those types of decisions. So like, there's some definite decision points. And I think that's something that I'm still wrestling with a little bit, is like, I feel like you could attack this from a couple of different ways on some of these points that we've talked about. And so at least being able to provide a blueprint of like, okay, you could do this, or you could do here, or you could do this, and then here's some of like the benefits and costs associated with each one of those, so that people are at least making an informed decision.
Okay. Bridget, one last.
Yeah, I think I'm just kind of underscoring what everybody else has said, but I think we have to be really careful that we're asking people to apply their energy in the right places that are really going to return something of value and of impact. And so, Joanne, you did such a great job. I was getting tired just kind of listening to you, outline the 10-step process. And I say that for two reasons. One, thinking again from a relatively rural state and knowing the capacity or the lack of capacity in so many of our school districts. And knowing that some schools are doing this literally on a board in a room that is their meeting room, and they're tracking kids with colored push pins and things. And they're getting real impact. So I would caution us in driving our energy into a system for that reason, but also because my sense is there, kind of 30 years plus of reform now, there is just a general feeling of fatigue across the board, in states and nationally. And we've got to find some way, with all the different things that are going on, you name it, of cutting through that fatigue and getting the impact.
And I think that's really important as well. And the more that we can show where there's overlaps, like of what you guys are already doing within the school, I think that's where we've seen a lot of progress is like where districts have been really good about like aligning all of that effort so that we are saying, okay, we know that you've been doing this and we know that you've been doing that, and this is how this kind of ties this together, or this is how it's just a little bit like we're complementing what the other things that we're doing.
Well, if there are no more questions, no more discussion, I think we should all give Sarah a big hand of applause and thank you.
Sorry, I can turn here around again.
Send you some vitamin C.
Thanks. Well, hopefully I'm on the other side of it at this point, but thank you guys for your patience with me.
Take care of yourself.
Thank you for joining.
Thanks, Sarah.
Bye.
All right, bye guys.
Bye.